Okay, so you want to own the Knights Templar. Before the white mantles and the red crosses and the crusading legend, start here. In the summer of 1191, the Templars bought a country, a whole island, throne and all, for 100,000 gold bazants, 40,000 paid up front, and the rest owed in installments, almost like a mortgage. 9 months later, they were begging the previous owner to take it back. The population had risen up against Templar tax collectors, and the Knights barely got out of the capital alive. That's Cyprus. Nobody puts that part on the recruiting poster. That's the actual balance sheet behind the most famous military order in history, and that's what we're here for. Forget the treasure hunting documentaries for a minute. Forget the Freemasons and the buried gold and the secret code carved into a chapel wall. The real story of the Knights Templar is a 200-year case study in how a charity turns into a bank, how a bank turns into the most trusted credit network in Christendom, and how being that trusted and that rich eventually gets you arrested by the one customer who owed you more than he could ever repay. Let's build the thing from the ground up. In 1119, in the wreckage of the First Crusade, a French knight named Hugues de Payens and a small group of companions, 9 men according to the traditional count, took vows in Jerusalem: poverty, chastity, obedience. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, and the name was not a marketing choice. They meant it literally. Their original seal shows 2 knights riding a single horse because the order supposedly couldn't afford one each. Their stated job was simple: protect Christian pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem, a road that had become a hunting ground for bandits the moment the crusading armies moved on. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem gave them a headquarters in a wing of the royal palace on the Temple Mount, built over what people believed were the ruins of Solomon's temple, hence the name that stuck. For the first decade, this was a fairly small operation. Then 2 things happened that turned a pilgrim escort charity into one of the wealthiest institutions in Europe. The first was the Council of Troyes in 1129, where the order got an official rule, written with the backing of Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman in Europe. Bernard didn't just bless the Templars, he wrote a whole tract in praise of this new kind of soldier, a man who could kill without sin because he killed for Christ. That endorsement was worth more than gold, because gold is what it produced. Nobles across France, England, Iberia, and the Holy Roman Empire started donating land, castles, and money to an order that the most respected monk in Christendom had personally vouched for. The second, and the one that actually built the business model, was a papal bull in 1139 called Omni Datum Optimum. Pope Innocent II declared the Templars answerable to no one but the Pope himself. Not the local bishop, not the local king, not the local tax collector. The order didn't have to pay tithes. It could keep its own priests. It could move money and goods across borders that stopped everyone else. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. Every other landowner in Europe hands over a slice of the harvest to the church and a slice to the crown. The Templars kept theirs. A donated farm that produced, say, 100 pounds of wool a year handed its full 100 pounds straight to the order, with nothing skimmed off the top by anybody. That single exemption is the seed of everything that follows. So now picture the actual machine on the ground, because it looked nothing like a monastery and nothing like an army. It looked like a farm conglomerate. Take Cressing Temple in Essex, England, one of the better documented Templar estates and the largest the order held in that county. About 1,400 acres, worked by more than 160 tenant farmers, with its own granary, dairy, dovecote, watermill, and windmill, plus the royal right to hold a weekly market and an annual fair. That's not a chapel with some fields attached. That's a self-contained agricultural business with a captive labor force, milling rights, and a legal monopoly on the local marketplace. Multiply Cressing Temple by hundreds of similar holdings scattered from Scotland to Sicily, and you start to see the shape of the thing. English Templar estates became major players in the wool trade specifically, because wool was the one commodity you could grow on marginal land, store, and export at a real margin. And because the order's tax-exempt status meant a fleece the Templars sold kept more of its sale price than the same fleece sold by a lay landowner down the road who owed a tithe on it. The Templars didn't run this network as landlords collecting rent and doing nothing else either. Each estate, called a preceptory or commandery, was managed directly by a handful of brother knights or sergeants who answered up a strict chain of command to regional commanders, and eventually to the Grand Master. It was centralized, audited, and standardized across an entire continent, at a time when most kings couldn't reliably tax their own capital city, let alone a province 300 miles away. That administrative discipline is the actual competitive advantage here. Everybody in medieval Europe owned land. Almost nobody could run land as a single coordinated enterprise across a dozen kingdoms with one command structure. The Templars could. Now here's where the farm conglomerate turns into a bank. A pilgrim heading to Jerusalem in the 12th century faced a genuine problem. How do you carry enough silver to survive an 18-month round trip without becoming the easiest robbery target on the road? Somewhere around the 1150s, the Templars started offering an answer. A traveler could deposit funds at a Templar house in London or Paris and receive a written document recording the deposit. He carried the document instead of the coin. At the other end, in Jerusalem or at a preceptory along the route, he presented the document and drew out an equivalent sum, minus a handling fee historians generally put at 1 or 2%. No silver crossed the Mediterranean in his saddlebag. What crossed the Mediterranean was information, backed by the reputation of an order with armed men, stone castles, and the Pope's personal guarantee standing behind every branch. This is, by most historians' reckoning, the first working international deposit and transfer system in Western history, centuries before anything a modern bank would recognize as a wire transfer. And it's worth being precise about what it was and wasn't. It was not a chip-and-pin cryptographic system. Whatever some breathless retellings online will tell you, it was a network built on standardized paperwork, a chain of trusted local agents, and the fact that stealing a piece of paper that means nothing without the order's cooperation gained a thief exactly nothing. The genius wasn't the code. The genius was the network and the enforcement behind it. Kings noticed. Henry II of England used the Templars to collect and hold the Saladin tithe, a special war tax raised after the disaster at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, when Jerusalem itself fell to Saladin. When Louis IX of France returned from his failed crusade in Egypt in the 1250s, badly needing cash, he took out a substantial loan from the order and left deposits with them in both Paris and Jerusalem. According to the historian Malcolm Barber, the scholar most historians treat as the leading academic authority on the Templars. From that point, the Paris Temple effectively functioned as the French royal treasury for stretches of the 13th century. Kings didn't use the Templars because the order was pious. They used the Templars because the order was the most reliable, most liquid, most professionally run financial institution on the continent. Full stop. If you needed a loan a local Italian merchant bank couldn't cover, or you needed your war chest guarded by men who would rather die than let it be stolen, you went to the temple. And this is the part worth sitting with for a second, because it's the whole show. A vow of personal poverty and an institution of enormous collective wealth are not a contradiction. They're the exact same mechanism you'd design on purpose if wealth extraction were the actual goal. No individual Templar could inherit the order's money, gamble it away, marry into it, or pass it down to children, because no individual Templar owned anything. Everything flowed up into a single corporate body that never divided, never remarried, and never died. A donation made to the order in 1150 was still working for the order 150 years later, compounding the whole time because there was never an heir to split the estate or a scandal to force a fire sale. Compare that to any noble family of the period, which fragmented every generation through inheritance, dowries, and war debts. The Templars had solved the one problem that destroyed every other medieval fortune: succession. Which brings us back to Cyprus, and to the one time the Templars tried to run an entire sovereign country the same way they ran a sheep farm, and found out the model doesn't scale to governing an angry population. When Richard the Lionheart conquered Cyprus in 1191 during the Third Crusade almost by accident, chasing down a rebel Byzantine governor who had insulted his fiancée, he had no particular use for a Mediterranean island and desperately needed cash for the actual crusade. So he sold it to the Templars for 100,000 Byzants. The order's approach to running their new possession was the same approach that worked so well on a manor in Essex. Extract maximum revenue through taxation. Administer tightly, don't ask the locals for buy-in. On a fenced-in estate with tenant farmers who had nowhere else to go, that worked. On an island with an entire Greek Cypriot population who had just traded one set of foreign rulers for another set demanding even harsher taxes to recoup a purchase price, it didn't. The population revolted, and a mob besieged the small Templar garrison holed up in Nicosia. The knights fought their way out, and within months the order handed the island back to Richard rather than keep fighting to hold it. Richard promptly resold it to the deposed king of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, who founded a dynasty that ruled Cyprus for the next 3 centuries. The lesson the order presumably drew from this, whether they said it out loud or not, is that the business model worked brilliantly on land you owned and terribly on a country you had to rule. For the next century, the order kept doing what it did best: farming Europe, banking for kings, and fighting a slow, losing war in the Holy Land. Jerusalem itself had already been lost to Saladin in 1187, 4 years before the Cyprus adventure. The Crusader states kept shrinking anyway, and in 1291, the fall of the city of Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold on the mainland, ended the order's actual founding purpose. There were no more pilgrim roads to guard because there was effectively no more Christian Holy Land left to make the pilgrimage to. Here is the uncomfortable structural problem that follows from that, and it's the same problem that eventually kills every institution built for one purpose that keeps its wealth after the purpose disappears. The Templars still had the estates. They still had the castles, the mills, the wool contracts, the deposits, the loans out to half the crowned heads of Europe. What they no longer had was an obvious reason to exist: a rich, heavily armed, tax-exempt organization answerable only to a pope in another country is tolerable to a king when it's doing something the king needs done. It becomes a problem the moment the king needs the money more than he needs the service. And the king in question, by the early 1300s, was Philip IV of France, and he needed the money badly. Philip had been at war with Flanders, and on and off with England. He had debased the French currency so many times that Parisian crowds rioted over it in 1306, a riot bad enough that Philip himself took shelter inside the Paris Temple, the Templars' own fortified headquarters while the mob tore through the city outside. Sit with that for a second. The king hid behind the order's walls for his own safety, and roughly a year later, he had those same walls broken open. In 1306, he had already expelled the Jewish population of France and seized their property and outstanding debts to refill his treasury. He had gone after the Lombard Italian bankers the same way. The Templars, by every account, were the next and by far the largest target on the list, and unlike the Jewish community or the Italian merchant houses, they had no foreign government to protect them, and, crucially, they owed Philip's ambitions something even more useful than money, an accusation the church itself could be pressured into endorsing. Before dawn on Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, sealed royal orders that had been circulating in secret for weeks were opened simultaneously across France. Royal officers arrested every Templar they could find in a single coordinated sweep, somewhere between 600 and 2,000 men depending on the source, including the Grand Master himself, Jacques de Molay. The charges were spectacular: heresy, idol worship, spitting on the cross during initiation, secret rites, under torture, and it was extensive and brutal. A startling number of Templars confessed to exactly the things their interrogators wanted to hear. Some later retracted. Molay himself confessed, then recanted, then was burned for it. It's worth being honest about the historical record here, rather than the legend. There is no solid contemporary evidence that any of these charges were true. A document known as the Chinon Parchment, rediscovered by the historian Barbara Fraile in the Vatican archives in 2001, shows that Pope Clement V privately absolved the Templars of heresy even while publicly allowing the trial to proceed, which strongly suggests the Pope himself did not believe the charges either, and simply lacked the political strength to stop a French king determined to see them through. Clement was a Frenchman, elected under heavy French pressure, and he spent his entire papacy based in France rather than Rome, in what later became known as the Avignon Papacy. He was not in a position to say no to Philip for very long, and here's where you have to separate the legend from the record. The popular version of this story, the one that fuels half the treasure hunting shows on cable television, has a fleet of Templar ships slipping out of the port of La Rochelle the night before the arrests, spiriting away a mountain of gold that nobody has ever found. It's a great scene. There's no contemporary document that actually supports it. What the royal record does show is commissioners fanning out across France in the weeks after the arrests to inventory Templar property house by house, a real, documented, unglamorous process, not a single dramatic vault cracking. And the deeper point still holds regardless of which version you find more satisfying. This order's wealth was never mainly a hoard of coin sitting in one basement waiting to be seized. It was land under cultivation, wool contracts, outstanding loans to half of European nobility, and a credit network built on trust rather than bullion. You cannot seize a network by kicking down one door. Philip, whatever else you want to say about him, mostly succeeded anyway. Just not by finding a treasure room. He succeeded by dismantling the institution that held the network together, and by keeping whatever cash and plate his own commissioners could actually catalog. The formal end came from Rome, not from Paris, though Paris wrote most of the script. At the Council of Vienne in 1312, Pope Clement V issued the Bull Vox in Excelso, suppressing the Order of the Temple permanently. Notice the careful legal wording. The order was dissolved as an administrative matter for the good of the church, not formally convicted of heresy, because the evidence to convict simply wasn't there, and everyone in the room knew it. A follow-up bull, Ad Providam, issued weeks later, granted the bulk of the order's property to its old rival and fellow military order, the Knights Hospitaller, everywhere except in the kingdoms of Aragon, Castile, Portugal, and Majorca, which were carved out for local arrangements. In practice, that transfer was a mess that dragged on for decades. Philip had already extracted a substantial amount of cash, plate, and jewels from Templar holdings in France before the ink on the papal bulls was even dry, and French royal officials went on resisting the handover of what remained for years afterward. The Hospitallers eventually got the property, but at a real cost. They had to take on pension obligations for the hundreds of former Templars who had been absolved and released rather than executed, on top of whatever fees the French crown quietly extracted from them along the way for the privilege of finally taking possession. Jacques de Molay himself was kept in prison for nearly 7 years while the case dragged on. In March of 1314, he was burned at the stake on an island in the Seine, along with another senior Templar official, after publicly retracting his earlier confession one last time in front of the crowd. The legend, and it is only a legend with no contemporary documentation behind it, holds that Molay cursed both Philip IV and Pope Clement V from the flames, summoning them to face divine judgment within the year. Both men did, in fact, die within months, Clement in April and Philip in November of that same 1314. That coincidence is exactly the kind of thing that writes better than fiction, which is precisely why it survived 7 centuries as a story, even though no chronicler at the time actually recorded the curse. Make of it what you will. Historians generally treat it as a later literary flourish. So, who actually got rich off the Knights Templar? Not Philip in the end, not really. He got a short-term cash infusion and the elimination of an enormous debt, but France's underlying underlying financial problems, the debased currency, and the endless wars outlived him by generations. Not the church, which spent the whole affair looking weak and complicit rather than powerful. The group that arguably came out ahead was, improbably, Portugal. King Denis of Portugal watched the dissolution unfold and made a shrewd calculation. Rather than let Portuguese Templar assets and personnel scatter to the Hospitallers or dissolve entirely, he petitioned the papacy for years to let him simply rebrand the order inside his own kingdom. In 1319, Pope John XXII agreed, and the Order of Christ was born, absorbing the same knights, the same castles, including the great fortress at Tamar that had been the Templars' Portuguese headquarters, and, before long, the same red cross, just recolored on a new habit. It was, functionally, the Knights Templar with a new name and a Portuguese king as its ultimate boss instead of a pope in Avignon. And this is where the story earns its ending, because a little over a century later, the Order of Christ's Grand Master was Prince Henry, better known to history as Henry the Navigator. The wealth of the old Templar network, still sitting in Portuguese land, tolls, and trade rights 200 years after Jacques de Molay burned, helped fund the earliest Portuguese voyages down the coast of West Africa. The Order of Christ's Red Cross was painted on the sails of the caravels that opened the sea route around Africa to India, part of the same wave of Iberian maritime expansion that, within a few decades, would also carry Spain's ships west across the Atlantic. An order founded to protect pilgrims walking to Jerusalem in 1119 ended up under a different name and a different flag, helping bankroll the ships that opened the Age of Discovery. Nobody planned that outcome. It's just what happens when you build a corporate structure durable enough to outlive the reason it was built. The financial techniques didn't disappear with the order either, even in France where the crown had crushed it outright. The letter of credit system and the deposit banking model, the idea that a paper claim could function as the equivalent of the coin it represented, kept being used and refined by others long after 1312. Historians of medieval finance generally credit the great Italian merchant banking houses of the following century, families like the Bardi and the Peruzzi of Florence, with building the more sophisticated bill of exchange system that actually underpins modern banking, developed mainly out of Italian commercial practice and the great trade fairs of Champagne rather than directly out of the temple's own ledgers. But the basic principle the Templars had already proven at scale, that a trusted document could safely stand in for money over a long distance, was very much in the air by then, and the order that first ran that trick internationally on a continental scale had already shown 2 centuries of European kings and merchants that it worked. So could you actually get rich owning the Knights Templar? For nearly 200 years, yes, spectacularly, as long as your revenue came from land you controlled directly, and credit you extended to people who could be pressured into repaying it. The moment your biggest customer was a king who owed you more than his pride could tolerate admitting, and the moment your founding mission quietly ran out from under you at Acre in 1291, you weren't a bank anymore. You were a debt that the debtor had realized he could simply refuse to pay and call it justice on the way out. The order that invented one of the safest ways to move money across a continent got destroyed by the one risk its own system had never been built to price: a sovereign borrower with nothing left to lose and a pope too weak to say no.